The Zelda series has come a long way since its inception in terms of combat. We went from stabbing to stabbing while jumping and crouching to swinging and performing sword dashes or spin attacks to full-on 3D swordplay with lots of different options in just a span of a decade, which is quite impressive. After the release of Ocarina of Time, however, these leaps in combat innovation started to plateau, and since then the combat system hasn't seen too many big overhauls. Well, with the exception of one particular game, but we will cover that one in a separate section. On the one hand, this isn't really a bad thing. It's inevitable that after experimenting with different styles and trying out different things, you ultimately land on something that is most efficient and start making less radical changes to the system. But it's not so much about Nintendo adding to the combat than it is about them taking things away. On a surface level, Breath of the Wild's combat system seems radically different because of the many new additions like flurry rushing and perfect guarding, bullet time, and using the environment or Sheikah Slate to your advantage. But in terms of actual one-to-one swordplay, not that much has changed. In fact, in a lot of ways it's actually watered down compared to previous installments like Twilight Princess, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In this video, I want to take a closer look at how the combat system of previous games measure up to that of the latest installment, that being Breath of the Wild, and see what kind of improvements can be made in the sequel, whether it being a return to form or completely new additions. Of course, since we are dealing with 3 dimensions here, I will limit the scope of this video to the 3D installments in the series, since the 2D games have a very different and more simplistic approach to combat, which suits those types of games. So let's get into it inside Breath of the Wild 2. Wait, damn it, wrong channel. Let's start at the beginning with Ocarina of Time, the first 3D installment which laid the groundwork for all future titles to come. Coming off of A Link to the Past, obviously this game had to completely reinvent how combat was going to work. As opposed to a simple stab or swing, Link was given numerous options to work with. Horizontal swings, vertical swings, stabs while crouching and shielding, jump attacks, spin attacks, and even some stuff that didn't necessarily add anything significant but was still an interesting addition, like being able to reverse your swinging pattern by tilting the control stick in the opposite direction of the first swing. As has become tradition for the 3D Zeldas, standard swings can be extended to a 3-part combo, with the third swing acting as the finisher, and after some cooldown it resets to the first swing. For each variation, the finisher is different. Again, this doesn't really change or impact the combat in any way, but it makes the sword combat seem more varied and complex than it really is. To complement all of this, Z-targeting made its debut as a way to focus your attacks on a specific enemy without losing track of its position. Some attacks like the regular stab, jump attack, and reverse horizontal swing cannot even be executed without it. Z-targeting also grants more defensive options like walking while shielding, sidestepping, and a backflip to dodge specific attacks. I remember as a kid purposely drawing out a fight to make it look like an epic battle whenever someone was watching me play. Some people seem to agree with Sequelitis that Z-targeting was trash and it created a disconnect between the combat section and the exploration section, but I completely disagree on that front. First of all, in most cases you don't have to target an enemy, it just makes the fights easier. In fact, in some occasions it's better not to Z-target because Z-targeting while having your sword out takes away the options to roll, instead replacing it with the jump attack. This elaborate combat system, especially for its time, has influenced many different games in the future to come, including the Zelda games following in its footsteps. Majora's Mask being developed in only a year and on the Ocarina engine understandably reused the exact same system, with the only difference being that Link now has different forms and thus some attacks are aesthetically different, with punches and kicks being added to the mix, but the core system remains largely the same. The Wind Waker saw the inclusion of parry moves, where you need to time a press of the A button right before an enemy attack to perform either a helm splitter or a backslice. Although I appreciate the inclusion, I'm not really the biggest fan of this mechanic. The reason being that this parry system is limited to specific enemy types and particularly the ones that can only be beaten using this technique. In other words, the game decides for you whether or not you can use it. It also makes some of the enemies like Darknuts feel a little bit more gimmicky, as you simply wait for that big flashy button accompanied with a loud sound and immediately hit their weak spots automatically. It also doesn't help that you don't have any control over which type of parry attack you use. The game simply chooses for you based on what kind of attack the enemy is performing, taking away any incentive or strategy from the player. And apparently Nintendo agreed with all of this, since in Twilight Princess this parry system was done away with again. The helm splitter and backslice are still a thing, but in this case can be triggered on command. The helm splitter after a shield bash and the backslice upon landing after a sidestep. And perhaps most famously for Twilight Princess, and a big fan favorite, was the addition of hidden skills. Link's base moveset wasn't anything special and almost identical to that of Ocarina of Time. However, this can be expanded upon by learning various hidden skills from the hero's shade, of which the aforementioned helm splitter and backslice are also part of. With the exception of the ending blow, which you are forced to learn since, well, it's used to kill Ganondorf at the end, none of the other hidden skills are mandatory to beat the game. This works really well as it can make fighting certain enemies, like again Darknuts, easier to fight with the hidden skills, but not near impossible without them. And just as a side note, Twilight Princess has by far the best underwater combat system in the entire series, just throwing that out there. Another thing to mention is the 3-part combo system from Ocarina of Time is once again present in both the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. A nice little inclusion this time around is that you can change between the different swings mid-combo by tilting the control stick in different directions between each attack. This can result in all kinds of different swings and finisher combinations. Again, this doesn't really impact the outcome, but it looks cool. And then we got Skyward Sword and it sucked. Moving on. Alright, I'm just kidding. Jokes aside though, Skyward Sword's combat is one of the most controversial aspects, and the Wii in general for that matter. Some thoroughly enjoyed it, while others broke their TV sets. I fall somewhere in between on this matter. I can see why Nintendo tried it, and for a game which made use of such an experimental control scheme, it performed reasonably well. One big thumbs up I would give to Skyward Sword is the fact that the directions of your swings actually matter this time around, something I was actually surprised wasn't included earlier to some degree. In previous installments, the direction of your sword swing was pure aesthetics and it didn't serve any other function. It had no impact on whether or not you would land a hit or not. Where the game gets a thumbs down, however, is that it only works well with certain types of enemies. I think Nintendo was a little overzealous with this mechanic and implemented it for pretty much every enemy in the game. This turned a lot of the combat in Skyward Sword into a slow-paced game of "Guess the direction the enemy will guard. Will he get it right, folks? Let's see. Oh, that was a shocker if I've ever seen one." And even if you were seemingly swinging in the right direction, some enemies like the Bokoblins shift their guard around so frequently and so abruptly that in some cases you're better off just swinging away in random directions anyway. I think it would have been better if this was reserved for only specific fights. The novelty of swinging a sword in real time was already enough to make it fun. If anything, forcing this directional swing mechanic on even the most basic enemies takes away that enjoyment. The fights with Girahim were fast-paced and exciting, so it definitely wasn't a complete failure. Of course, I cannot really use Skyward Sword's combat as an example for most things related to Breath of the Wild and its sequel, since it exists in its own world. And given the controversy surrounding the motion controls, I highly doubt Nintendo is going back to this control scheme anytime soon, unless we maybe get a Zelda game in VR one day. As mentioned in the opening narrative, Breath of the Wild's combat options overall are amazing when looking at the whole picture, but at the same time the actual swordplay was heavily stripped down, which is quite ironic if you take into account all the different weapons we're allowed to use in this installment. All those different swing directions, finishers, and options we talked about earlier have been neglected, and we are now stuck with the same simple 3-swing combo for one-handed weapons, 2 swings for two-handed ones, and a 5-stab combo for spears and halberds. You can no longer influence the direction or the finishing move, which is kinda boring if you ask me. I am of course aware that Breath of the Wild introduced many new things in the form of the Sheikah Slate, more emphasis on the bow, and generally using the environment to your advantage. But let's be fair here. Outside of the Great Plateau tutorial section and some situational moments here and there to clear out camps, the only rune to really be effective in high-paced combat scenarios was Stasis Plus, and maybe occasionally a bomb. But good luck trying to kill a Lynel with a boulder or hit a Lizalfos with a metal crate after it's already spotted you. Besides, we are primarily focusing on sword combat here. So here's what I would change to the overall sword mechanics for the sequel. First of all, bring back the hidden skills. This is a no-brainer. Having the option to expand your moveset is always a good thing in my book, especially if it's handled like in Twilight Princess and isn't mandatory. If it's not mandatory, it won't get in the way of the open nature of the game and thus will not bother anyone who doesn't feel like collecting everything. Hidden skills are purely there to make Link more powerful and expand his options, but are not required to beat any specific enemy. Second, expand the combos you can perform with each weapon. I can't believe I'm making this comparison, but remember Star Fox Adventures, aka The Legend of Fox Dinosaur Planet, where you could perform all these flashy combinations and finishers? Sure, the combat itself was quite repetitive, but it was cool how you could make Fox do all kinds of different strings, ending with a jump attack, a roundhouse kick, or spin his staff around like a helicopter blade. Say what you want about this game, but some of the moves you could perform were pretty damn cool. And just like in the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, you can alternate directions on the control stick to change the order of the combo. In Breath of the Wild, all that stuff was gone, which is a pretty big step back if you ask me, especially since this is the first game in the series where we can use so many different kinds of weapons. Next, make the enemy AI more varied in combat scenarios. Now, I know what you're thinking, the AI was already pretty advanced for a Zelda game, right? Especially the Bokoblins and Moblins. In terms of their overall behavior, yes. And the way they interacted with some of the Sheikah runes or the environment, definitely. But in terms of actual one-to-one duels, not so much. It still boils down to waiting, blocking, and the occasional parry here and there, and just wailing on them like there's no tomorrow. There's also no way to break an enemy's defense other than bashing away at their shield or waiting until they let their guard down. This ties in with the hidden skills we covered earlier. In Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, you could use the shield bash to open an enemy up, and in the case of Twilight Princess, use the backslice or helm splitter to circumvent the enemy's defense. In general, I would love to see a more unpredictable attack pattern, where you need to use different strategies to outsmart an enemy, which in the case of Breath of the Wild doesn't really happen unless you're fighting a boss. Ultimately, one of the biggest reasons for a lack of impressive sword duels is of course the enemy variety, something that a lot of people seem to agree with. No Darknuts, Stalfos, Iron Knuckles, Redads, or any of the other classic enemies can be found, which is a shame as fighting some of these enemies was very entertaining. Now this next one is a bit more of a personal one, so I'm curious to see how many of you agree with me. Be sure to let me know down in the comments. So here's my take. Giving an enemy insane amounts of HP isn't hard. It's tedious. I am of course referring to the color variations of each enemy, and in particular the silver and, if you're playing on hard mode, the golden types. Making a fight an ordeal because it takes ages to chip away at their health creates the illusion of difficulty, but the fight itself isn't actually challenging. The same strategies still apply. The only quote-unquote challenge here is not losing your focus and attention because of the endless repetition of doing the same thing over and over. It's a test of patience more than it is a test of skill. Once you've become good at the game and can parry almost any attack successfully, trigger flurry rushes, and generally know the attack pattern of each enemy, you are left with very little than spending a long time to take down an enemy. Hard mode's idea of difficulty was to just have enemies regenerate health, which I think is kind of a lazy solution to up the difficulty. This also clashes heavily with the weapon durability system. I've stated before in previous videos that I don't really have a problem with the durability. In fact, I think it was kind of a nice change of pace for the series and incentivized exploration and testing out different weapons. But burning through 2/3 of your inventory or even more in the process of bringing down a silver or golden Lynel is a bit much if you ask me. The reward doesn't outweigh the sacrifice. Either the durability of the weapons needs to go up, or even better, make the enemy types stronger by making their behavior more unpredictable. Expand their moveset with attacks which the weaker variants don't use. It's fine if they have more HP, but not to this degree. That's just my opinion, of course. Some quick honorable mentions I would also like to see: bring back some sort of roll mechanic. This doesn't have to replace the jump by any means, but rolling has always been that little extra option to shift your hurt box and dodge certain attacks. I especially miss this mechanic while fighting certain enemies like Stone Talus or a Hinox. It would be great to be able to roll underneath them and attack them from behind. And as we saw in the Star Fox example, a roll could perhaps be expanded with a hidden skill which allows you to do a lunge attack right after. Additionally, I would also love to see a certain degree of aerial combat options. We've had a jump attack since Ocarina of Time, and Breath of the Wild had this too, together with a sort of ground pound type of move while paragliding. But I'm talking about actual sword swings while jumping in the air. You know, like we see Link do in Super Smash Bros. Again, I absolutely love the new additions Breath of the Wild brought in when it comes to fighting enemies, but I do feel like Nintendo stripped away a little too much from the previous titles when it comes to the flexibility the sword has. Having access to spears and all kinds of other different weapons is great, however their use is quite limited aside from the regular predetermined swings, throwing a weapon, or a charge attack. Link is a pretty agile and young dude, so he can get a bit more acrobatic with his fighting style. Maybe he should take some notes from Monk Mas Koshia. For a 10,000-year-old guy, he's pretty light on his feet. Now, it's hard to say exactly if Nintendo will make big changes to the combat system in Breath of the Wild 2, or if they will greatly expand the amount of enemy types for that matter. The big question is, of course, what will Link's new magic hand abilities be used for? As of right now, besides speculation, we have no idea what the implications of this new mechanic will be, nor do we even know if it will be used in combat. Will it affect Link's sword-wielding arm? Can we still use two-handed weapons, and can we use one-handed weapons in conjunction with the green arm? As of right now, I don't want to get too speculative about this mechanic in today's video, so for now all we can do is wait until we actually see some gameplay, which I'm super hyped for, and I hope you are too. And now it's time to give you all an update about my upcoming schedule, because the next few weeks are going to be a bit different from the norm. Starting this Sunday, I'll be leaving for my annual hiking trip, so I won't be making any content until August 8th. However, I'm planning to record one small additional video tomorrow if I can find the time, and I will schedule this video to go up next weekend to fill in the gap. This video will not feature any high quality editing or animations, as I only have one day to produce it. My big calamity video I decided to save for after I come back and finish it with a clear mindset, since as you can probably imagine I'm doing a lot of preparation right now. This way I can also premiere the episode properly. August itself will be filled with different kinds of projects, a couple of which will be collaborations with other creators, so I hope you look forward to that. I also have a couple of new Patreon supporters to announce, so a big warm welcome to William Morales, Lord Gannon, Larissa Jarvis, Jen Joe, and Julia Clemon. Thank you all so much for joining. You guys rock. With that said, I will see you all in roughly 2 weeks, and as always, thank you for watching. This is Don signing off, and have a good one.